The Threads of Tomorrow. Windhaven was the kind of town where strangers rarely passed through, and secrets rarely stayed buried. Nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains that seemed to touch the clouds, it was a place of simple routines and quiet lives. Yet, the day everything changed started like any other. Ellie Whitmore stood by the window of her art gallery, the morning light casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Her easel stood untouched in the corner, a blank canvas mocking her from its perch. It had been months since she'd painted anything. Inspiration felt as distant as the snow-capped peaks that framed the town. Across the street, Nate Grayson leaned against the counter of the diner, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug. His students often teased him about his reluctance to order anything more modern. He preferred things simple, predictable qualities he'd come to value after his life unraveled 2 years ago. At the same time, Lily Carter strummed her guitar on a park bench nearby, her fingers dancing over the strings as she hummed a melody only she could hear. The music was her escape, a fleeting refuge from the chaos waiting for her at home. And Maggie Reed, walking with her cane toward the town square, paused to greet a passing neighbor. Despite her years, she moved with a quiet determination, her eyes holding the wisdom of someone who had seen more than she cared to admit. It happened in an instant. A loud screech of tires, followed by a sickening crash, shattered the town's serenity. A delivery truck barreled through the intersection, slamming into a parked car before careening into a lamppost. The sound echoed through Windhaven like a thunderclap. Ellie dropped her coffee cup, the ceramic shattering at her feet. Nate bolted from the diner, his heart pounding as adrenaline took over. Lily's guitar slipped from her hands as she froze, the melody in her head replaced by the cacophony of chaos. Maggie, who had been closest to the scene, stumbled backward, clutching her chest. The square erupted into movement. People ran toward the wreckage, their voices a mixture of panic and concern. Ellie was among the first to reach the truck, her hands trembling as she tried to open the crumpled door. "Someone call 911. She shouted, her voice cracking. Nate appeared beside her, his calm demeanor belying the storm inside him. "I'm here," he said, helping her pull the door open. Together, they managed to free the driver, a young man barely out of his teens, bleeding but conscious. As the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, the four strangers found themselves drawn together, united by a single moment that would alter the course of their lives forever. The morning after the accident, Windhaven carried an air of uneasy silence, the kind of silence that lingered after the storm, where people whispered behind closed doors and the echoes of the event replayed in their minds. Ellie sat in her gallery, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee on the counter. The aroma was sharp, but she couldn't bring herself to drink it. Her hands still shook when she thought about the boy in the truck, his pale face and the way his voice wavered as he whispered, "I didn't mean to." The bell above the gallery door jingled, breaking her trance. It was Maggie, her cane clicking softly against the floor. "Ellie, dear," Maggie said, her voice warm but firm, "I brought you something." She held out a small, hand-knitted scarf, the kind Maggie often gave to comfort those who needed it. Ellie blinked, surprised. "You didn't have to." "I did," Maggie interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. She gestured to the stool by the counter. "Mind if I sit?" Ellie nodded, watching as Maggie lowered herself onto the seat, with practiced ease. "You were there yesterday," Maggie began, her eyes searching Ellie's face. "You helped that boy." Ellie looked down at her hands. "I just did what anyone would do." "Not everyone," Maggie said softly. A silence fell between them, and Ellie could feel Maggie's gaze, steady and knowing. It was the kind of look that made Ellie want to spill everything to talk about the guilt she carried from losing her parents, the nights she spent staring at blank canvases, the fear that she would never be enough. But instead, she simply said, "Thank you for the scarf." Across town, Nate stood in his classroom, watching as his students filed in one by one. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the worn desks and the whiteboard where he'd written the day's lesson, The Power of Words. "Mr. Grayson," one of his students, Jake, called out. "You okay? You look tired." Nate smiled faintly. "Thanks for your concern, Jake," Let's just say it was a long night. The truth was, Nate hadn't slept much. The accident had dredged up memories. He thought he buried the night he lost his wife, Emma, to a similar tragedy. The parallels were haunting. As he began the lesson, his mind wandered to the faces he'd seen yesterday: Ellie's determination, Maggie's quiet strength, and the girl with the guitar who had looked so lost. He didn't know why, but he felt a strange pull toward them, as if fate had tethered their lives together. Meanwhile, Lily sat on her bed, her guitar propped against the wall. She stared at her phone, the screen filled with messages from her mother. "Where are you? Why didn't you come home last night?" She sighed, tossing the phone aside. Her mother's anger was nothing new, but last night had been different. Watching the accident unfold had shaken something loose in Lily, a reminder of how fragile life was, and how desperately she wanted to escape the confines of Windhaven. Her fingers itched to play, to turn her emotions into music, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she grabbed her backpack and headed out, her feet leading her toward the town square where the remnants of the crash still lingered. As the day wore on, the lives of Ellie, Nate, Lily, and Maggie continued to orbit around each other, their paths crossing in subtle ways. None of them could have predicted how deeply entwined their stories would become, or how the threads of yesterday's tragedy would weave a tapestry of hope and redemption. The wind in Windhaven carried a chill that morning, brushing against the faces of those who gathered in the town square. The shattered glass and twisted metal from the accident had been cleared away, but the emotional wreckage lingered. Ellie stood at the edge of the square, sketchbook in hand. She hadn't meant to come back here, but something about the scene drew her in. She crouched near the lamppost where the truck had crashed, her pencil gliding across the page as she captured the faint cracks in the pavement, and the shadowy outlines of the wreckage still imprinted in her mind. "You draw?" a voice asked, breaking her focus. Ellie looked up to see Nate standing a few feet away, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "Sometimes," she replied, closing the sketchbook instinctively. Nate gestured toward the bench nearby. "Mind if I sit?" She hesitated, then nodded. As he sat, an awkward silence settled between them. Nate wasn't sure why he had approached her. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, like she was carrying something too heavy for one person. "I saw you yesterday," he finally said. "You didn't hesitate to help." Ellie shrugged. "I just did what needed to be done. You and Maggie both," Nate continued, his voice thoughtful. "She's been a part of this town longer than anyone, but I don't think I've ever seen her look so shaken." Ellie tilted her head, curious. "You know her well?" "Not really," Nate admitted, "but I've heard stories. People say she's seen more than most of us could imagine." Ellie smiled faintly. "Sounds about right." For a moment, the two sat in companionable silence, the hum of the town around them filling the gaps in their conversation. Elsewhere, Lily wandered through the woods on the outskirts of town, her guitar slung over her shoulder. She needed to get away to breathe. The events of the previous day played over in her mind like a broken record. The sight of the driver's bloodied face, the screams of the onlookers, it was too much. She stopped by a small clearing, her favorite spot. The sunlight filtered through the trees, painting the ground with golden patches. Sitting on a fallen log, she pulled out her guitar and strummed a few chords. The melody was raw, unpolished, but it flowed from her fingers like a confession. "What are you running from, Lily?" she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. The answer came too easily: her mother's anger, her father's absence, the weight of expectations that felt impossible to meet. Maggie sat in her kitchen, a cup of tea cooling on the table in front of her. Her hands trembled as she unfolded an old photograph, a black and white snapshot of a young man standing in front of the Windhaven General Store. "Henry," she murmured, her voice cracking. The memory of him was sharp, like the edge of a blade. He had been her everything once, but the war had taken him, leaving her with nothing but a collection of fading photographs and an aching heart. She traced her fingers over his face, her thoughts drifting to the accident. The boy in the truck reminded her of Henry in some inexplicable way: his youth, his vulnerability. A knock at the door startled her. She quickly folded the photograph and tucked it away, before calling out, "Come in." It was Ellie, holding the scarf Maggie had given her. "I just wanted to say thank you again." Ellie said, stepping inside. Maggie smiled, gesturing for her to sit. You're welcome, dear T. Ellie nodded, and as Maggie poured, the two women sat in a comfortable quiet, their unspoken burdens hanging between them like ghosts. The threads connecting Ellie, Nate, Lily, and Maggie were still fragile, but they were there, pulling tighter with each passing day. None of them knew it yet, but they were about to embark on a journey that would unravel their deepest secrets, and help them find the strength they had long believed lost. The days following the accident brought a peculiar energy to Windhaven. For some, it was a reminder of life's fragility. For others, it became a call to confront their own past-exposed parts of themselves they had buried in the quiet routines of the town. Ellie had returned to her gallery, determined to lose herself in her work. But as she stood in front of her easel, brush in hand, the canvas remained untouched. Images from the accident lingered in her mind, overshadowing any inspiration she might have found. Her thoughts drifted to Nate, the quiet schoolteacher who had helped her at the scene. There had been something about his presence, steady, grounded, that had left an impression. She wondered how someone like him had ended up in Windhaven. The sound of the bell above her door snapped her back to the present. Ellie? Maggie's voice called out as she stepped inside, her cane tapping softly against the floor. Ellie smiled, relieved to see a familiar face. Maggie, hi, what brings you here? Maggie held up a small package wrapped in brown paper. I thought you might need some inspiration. This belonged to my late husband, Henry. He was an artist, like you. Ellie took the package carefully, her curiosity piqued. Thank you, I'll take good care of it. Maggie's eyes softened. I know you will. She hesitated, then added, sometimes, the things we create can help us understand the things we can't say. Meanwhile, Nate stood in front of his classroom, but his mind was elsewhere. The accident had stirred something in him, a sense of unease he couldn't shake. His students' chatter faded into the background as he stared out the window, his thoughts drifting to Emma, his late wife. Mr. Grayson? The voice brought him back. It was Jake, one of his more outspoken students, standing beside his desk with a curious expression. Sorry, Jake, what's up? Jake shrugged. You seem different lately. Are you okay? Nate forced a smile. Just a lot on my mind. Jake nodded, but his concern lingered. If you ever need to talk, you know, we're here for you too. The simplicity of the gesture caught Nate off guard. For a moment, he saw a flicker of Emma's kindness in the boy's eyes, and he had to look away before the emotion overwhelmed him. Lily, on the other hand, had taken to avoiding the town square altogether. She spent her days wandering the outskirts of Windhaven, her guitar slung over her shoulder like a shield. She found herself at the old train station, a place she often came to dream about escaping. Sitting on the platform, she began to play, her music filling the empty space around her. The melody was raw and haunting, a reflection of the turmoil inside her. But as she played, she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she saw Nate standing a few feet away. Sorry, he said, raising his hands. I didn't mean to interrupt. Lily shrugged, her fingers still on the strings. It's fine, not like anyone else is listening. Nate hesitated, then sat down on the bench beside her. You're really good. Have you ever thought about playing for an audience? Lily snorted. Yeah, right. Like anyone in this town wants to hear what I have to say. You'd be surprised, Nate said quietly. Sometimes, people need to hear the things we're afraid to say out loud. Lily glanced at him, unsure what to make of his words, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. That evening, Ellie unwrapped the package Maggie had given her. Inside was a worn sketchbook, its pages filled with detailed drawings of Windhaven, as it had been decades ago. One sketch caught her eye, a portrait of a young woman, with striking eyes and a wistful smile. The name scrawled beneath it read Margaret. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. It was Maggie, unmistakably, but much younger. The drawing was filled with such tenderness, that Ellie felt as though she were intruding on something private. She flipped the page, and there, written in elegant handwriting, were the words, "To my dearest Maggie, even if the world changes, my heart will always stay with you. Henry." Ellie closed the sketchbook, her chest tight with emotion. She knew there was more to Maggie's story than she had let on, and for the first time, Ellie felt compelled to learn the truth. The threads connecting the four were tightening, their lives overlapping in ways they could not yet see. Each carried secrets that longed to be uncovered, and the accident had set something in motion, something none of them could stop. The Windhaven Library was one of the oldest buildings in town, its tall windows and creaking wooden shelves offering a quiet refuge for those seeking answers or escape. Ellie found herself there on a gray afternoon, the weight of Maggie's sketchbook pressing heavily in her bag. She had spent the morning flipping through its pages, captivated by the world Henry had captured in his art. But it was the words, the letters he had written to Maggie, that lingered in her mind. There was something so raw, so intimate about them that Ellie felt as though she were trespassing. Lost in thought, she didn't notice Nate until he spoke. "Ellie?" She jumped, clutching the strap of her bag. "Nate. You scared me." "Sorry," he said, holding up his hands. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." He gestured toward the table where she sat. "Mind if I join you?" She hesitated, then nodded. As he sat, Ellie noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped as though carrying an invisible burden. "You okay?" she asked before she could stop herself. Nate gave her a small, tired smile. "Funny, I was about to ask you the same thing." Ellie glanced at the sketchbook, peeking out of her bag, and decided to change the subject. "What brings you here?" "Research," he said, tapping a stack of history books he'd set on the table. "I'm working on a project with my students, something about uncovering the stories behind the people who built this town." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ambitious," he chuckled. "Yeah, well, they don't seem too thrilled about it either, but I figure if they can connect with the past, maybe they'll appreciate the present a little more." Her gaze softened. "That's actually kind of beautiful." Nate looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "Thanks," he said quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their unspoken thoughts filling the space between them. Lily sat on the steps of the old church at the edge of town, her guitar resting on her lap. She wasn't playing, just staring at the carved stone angels that adorned the building's facade. "You're here again," Maggie's voice called out, and Lily turned to see the older woman approaching with her cane. "Yeah," Lily said, scooting over to make room. "It's quiet here." Maggie settled beside her, the two of them sitting in companionable silence for a while. "You remind me of someone I used to know," Maggie said eventually, her gaze distant. Lily glanced at her. "Yeah? Who?" "My son," Maggie replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "He had the same fire in him, the same restlessness, always felt like he didn't belong anywhere." Lily looked away, unsure how to respond. "He left Windhaven when he was your age," Maggie continued. "Said he needed to find his place in the world. I never stopped him," but she paused, her voice breaking slightly. "I never saw him again." "I'm sorry," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maggie smiled faintly. "It's okay, dear. Sometimes, life takes us down paths we don't expect." She placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. "Just remember, no matter where you go, there's always someone who cares about you." Lily felt a lump rise in her throat but said nothing. That evening, Ellie found herself outside Maggie's house, the sketchbook tucked under her arm. She had wrestled with the decision all day, but couldn't shake the feeling that Maggie deserved to have it back. When Maggie opened the door, her eyes widened at the sight of the book. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Among some of Henry's things," Ellie explained. "I thought you might want it." Maggie's hand shook as she took the book, holding it as though it were a fragile relic. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes glistening. Ellie hesitated, then said, "Maggie, I read some of it." "The letters, they're beautiful." Maggie nodded, her gaze distant. "He had a way with words. I used to think he could see right into my soul." Ellie wanted to ask more but didn't want to intrude. "Instead," she said, "if you ever want to talk about him, I'd love to listen." Maggie smiled, her expression softening. "You're a kind soul, Ellie. Don't ever lose that." As the days passed, the lives of Ellie, Nate, Lily, and Maggie continued to intertwine their shared moments, becoming more frequent, their walls slowly coming down, but the secrets they carried were like storm clouds on the horizon, waiting for the right moment to unleash their fury. And when that moment came, nothing in Windhaven would ever be the same. The quiet streets of Windhaven seemed unchanged to most, but for Ellie, Nate, Lily, and Maggie, the days following the accident felt charged with an unspoken tension. Their lives were slowly shifting, like tectonic plates beneath the surface, preparing for an inevitable quake. Ellie stood in her gallery, staring at a blank canvas. For days now, she had tried to paint, to pour her emotions into something tangible, but every stroke felt wrong. The sketchbook Maggie had given her rested on the counter, its pages haunting her thoughts. A knock on the door startled her. She turned to see Nate standing outside, his hands in his pockets. "Hey," he said when she opened the door. "I wasn't sure if you'd be here." "Come in," Ellie replied, stepping aside. "What's up?" Nate hesitated, then said, "I found something I thought you might want to see." He pulled out a folded newspaper from his jacket and handed it to her. The headline read, "Local artist's mysterious disappearance still unsolved." Beneath it was a photo of a young man, standing in front of Windhaven's town square. "That's Henry," Ellie whispered, recognizing him immediately from the sketches in Maggie's book. Nate nodded. "I was doing some research for my students and came across this. The article says he vanished one night after a gallery opening. No note, no explanation." Ellie frowned, her mind racing. Maggie never mentioned this. "Maybe it's too painful," Nate offered, "but if anyone can talk to her about it, it's probably you." Ellie glanced at the sketchbook on the counter, a sense of purpose settling over her. "I'll try." Lily sat on the edge of the lake, her guitar balanced on her knee. She strummed absent-mindedly, her thoughts far from the music. She had avoided going home for days now, unwilling to face her mother's anger. "You've got talent, you know," a voice said behind her. Lily turned to see Maggie, leaning on her cane as she approached. "Shouldn't you be resting?" Lily asked, half smiling. Maggie waved her off. "Rest is for when you're old." "Oh, waity, I'm old." Lily laughed despite herself. "What are you doing out here?" "Looking for you," Maggie said, sitting down beside her with a soft groan. "I figured you'd be hiding somewhere with a guitar of yours." Lily's smile faded. "I'm not hiding." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Aren't you?" Lily looked away, her fingers tightening on the strings. "It's complicated. Life usually is," Maggie said gently, "but running doesn't solve anything. Believe me, I know." Lily glanced at her, curious. "Did you ever run away?" Maggie's eyes grew distant. "Not physically, but emotionally?" "More times than I can count," she sighed. "I pushed people away because it was easier than letting them see how much I was hurting. But in the end, it just made me lonelier." Lily didn't reply, but Maggie's words lingered in her mind, long after the older woman left. That evening, Ellie knocked on Maggie's door, the newspaper tucked under her arm. When Maggie answered, her face lit up with a smile. "Ellie, dear, come in." Ellie stepped inside, her heart pounding. She handed Maggie the newspaper without a word, watching as the older woman's expression shifted from surprise to sorrow. "Where did you find this?" Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nate showed it to me," Ellie said. "I didn't know Henry disappeared." Maggie's hands trembled as she set the paper on the table. "I don't talk about it," she admitted. "It's too painful." Ellie hesitated, then said, "I think Henry's art was his way of processing things. He couldn't say out loud. Maybe it's time for you to do the same." Maggie looked at her, tears brimming in her eyes. "You're right," she said after a long pause. "It's time." At the same time, Nate was at home, sitting at his desk with a pile of letters spread before him. They were from Emma, written during their early years together. He had avoided reading them for months, unable to face the memories they contained. But tonight, something felt different. He picked up the first letter and began to read, Emma's voice coming alive in his mind. As the words flowed off the page, "Nate, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to say these things in person, but I need you to know how much I love you, how much I believe in you. You're stronger than you think, and you'll find your way, even if it feels impossible now. Tears blurred his vision, but he kept reading, letting her words wash over him like a balm for his wounded soul. The threads connecting Ellie, Nate, Lily, and Maggie were tightening, their lives intertwining in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. But as their secrets began to surface, so did the cracks in their armor. And when those cracks finally gave way, the truth would either break them or set them free. The first snow of the season blanketed Windhaven in a soft, silencing layer of white. The town square sparkled under the pale sunlight, but beneath its calm exterior, the lives of Ellie, Nate, Lily, and Maggie churned like an unseen storm. Ellie found herself at Maggie's home again, the sketchbook and newspaper, now joined by a small box Maggie had retrieved from a closet. The box was filled with letters, photographs, and unfinished sketches, all tied to Henry's life. "I don't know why I kept these," Maggie said, her voice distant. "Maybe I thought one day he'd come back, and we'd sort through it together." Ellie sat beside her, thumbing through the items. "It must have been hard, not knowing what happened to him." Maggie nodded. "It was unbearable at first. I searched everywhere, wrote to people who knew him, even hired a private investigator, but there was nothing. It was like he vanished into thin air." Ellie hesitated, then said, "Do you ever think he might have left on purpose?" Maggie froze, her expression tightening. "I'm sorry," Ellie said quickly. "I didn't mean." "No," Maggie interrupted, her voice firm but shaky. "It's a fair question. I've asked myself the same thing 1,000 times, and the truth is, I don't know. Maybe he needed to escape something I couldn't understand, or maybe I wasn't enough to keep him here." Ellie reached out, placing a hand on Maggie's. "You can't blame yourself." Maggie looked at her, tears filling her eyes. "It's hard not to." Nate stood in his classroom after school hours, staring at the bulletin board, filled with his students' work. They had been researching the history of Windhaven, and their findings were both fascinating and unsettling. One of the projects caught his eye, a timeline of notable events in the town's history. Among the dates, one stood out: October 12, 1978. Henry Albright disappears after gallery opening. Nate felt a strange pull toward the name. He had heard Ellie mention it in passing, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Deciding he needed answers, he grabbed his coat and headed to Ellie's gallery. Lily, meanwhile, had ventured into the attic of her family home. For the first time in years, the space was cluttered with old boxes and forgotten belongings, but she was searching for something specific: her father's journal. Her parents had split when she was young, and her father's absence had left a void she rarely acknowledged. But Maggie's words about running away had stirred something in her, and she needed to understand why her father had left. After nearly an hour of searching, she found Ida Weathered leather-bound journal tucked away in a corner. Sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor, she opened it and began to read. "Lily is so much like her mother, fierce, stubborn, and full of fire. I love her more than words can say, but I fear I'm not the man she needs me to be. I don't know how to stay when all I feel is the pull to leave." Tears blurred her vision as she read on, her father's words, revealing a man torn between love and his own demons. Ellie was in her gallery, sorting through a shipment of supplies, when Nate walked in. "Hey," she said, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I need to ask you something," Nate said, his tone serious. Ellie set down the box she was holding. "What's going on?" He pulled out a folder containing some of his students' research. "Do you know much about Henry Albright?" Ellie's stomach tightened. "Why?" "My students found some articles about him," Nate explained. "I know he was connected to Maggie, and I figured you might know more." Ellie hesitated. "Maggie's told me a little. He was her husband, and he disappeared years ago. She still doesn't know why." Nate nodded, his expression pensive. "I think there's more to the story, and I think it's connected to something else I've been trying to figure out." Ellie frowned. "What do you mean?" Nate hesitated, then said, "I lost someone too. My wife, Emma, and ever since she died, I felt like there's something. I'm supposed to find some answer, I'm supposed to uncover. I don't know why, but I think Henry's story might be part of it." Ellie stared at him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "Nate." Before she could say more, the door to the gallery opened, and Lily stepped in, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "I think I know why people leave," she said, holding up her father's journal. That night, the four of them gathered at Maggie's house, the air thick with unspoken tension. They each carried pieces of a puzzle they didn't yet know how to solve, their lives, now tangled in ways none of them could have foreseen. As they shared their stories, Maggie's loss, Nate's grief, Lily's search for understanding, and Ellie's quest for meaning, they began to see the connections between them. But it was Maggie who said what they were all thinking. "Sometimes, the only way to find the answers we're looking for is to face the shadows we've been running from." The room fell silent as her words sank in, and in that moment, they realized that whatever truths lay ahead, they would face them together. The following morning dawned cold and clear, the crisp air carrying with it a sense of anticipation. Ellie, Nate, Lily, and Maggie had decided to meet at the Windhaven Library, to dive deeper into Henry's story. The library's archives held decades of history, and they were determined to uncover the missing pieces. Ellie sat at a long oak table, flipping through a stack of old newspapers. The faint smell of aged paper filled the room as sunlight streamed through the tall windows. Maggie sat beside her, tracing her fingers over faded photographs, her face a mask of concentration. On the other side of the table, Nate was scanning through microfilm reels, while Lily pored over handwritten journals, donated to the library by longtime residents of Windhaven. "Here," Ellie said suddenly, holding up a newspaper clipping. The others looked up as she read aloud. Henry Albright, renowned artist and beloved member of the Windhaven community, held his final gallery opening on October 12, 1978. The exhibit, titled Fragments of Light, was said to be his most personal work, yet, exploring themes of loss and renewal. Hours after the event, Albright disappeared, leaving behind only a cryptic note that read, "To find the light, one must first embrace the shadow." "What does that mean?" Lily asked, frowning. Maggie's hands trembled as she took the clipping from Ellie. "It sounds like something he would say," she murmured. "Henry always believed art was a way to confront our darkest truths." Nate leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. What if this wasn't just about art? What if he was trying to leave a message? As the hours passed, they uncovered more fragments of Henry's life. Letters he had written to gallery owners, sketches he had donated to local schools, even a rare interview in which he spoke about his love for Windhaven, and his struggles with mental health. But it wasn't until Lily stumbled upon an old ledger, tucked away in the library's basement, that they found something truly startling. "Guys, you need to see this," she called out, her voice echoing in the dusty room. The others gathered around as she opened the ledger to a page, filled with names and dates. Beside Henry's name was a single word reclaimed. "What does that mean?" Ellie asked, her brow furrowed. Nate ran a hand through his hair. "It could mean anything: debt repaid, property returned." Maggie's face went pale. "Or a life taken back," she whispered. The others turned to her in shock. "What are you saying?" Lily asked. Maggie hesitated, then said, "There's a story that's been passed down in this town, a legend about a secret group called the Reclaimers. They believed in balancing the scales of life, righting wrongs that couldn't be fixed through ordinary means. If Henry crossed paths with them..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Later that evening, they reconvened at Ellie's gallery, the weight of their discovery hanging over them. Maggie sat by the fireplace, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "I thought those stories were just myths," she said softly. "But now, I'm not so sure." Ellie paced the room, her mind racing. If this group really existed, and if Henry was involved with them, then maybe his disappearance wasn't an accident. Maybe he chose to leave or was forced to. But why? Lily asked, frustration lacing her voice. What could he have done that was so terrible? Maggie shook her head. "I don't know. He never spoke of anything like that. But he was always restless, like he was searching for something he couldn't name." Nate, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke. "I think we're missing something." Henry's note said, "To find the light, one must first embrace the shadow." "What if that's the key?" "What do you mean?" Ellie asked. "What if he wasn't running away? What if he was trying to face something dark?" something that scared him. Nate's voice grew steadier as he spoke, and maybe he thought disappearing was the only way to do it. Silence filled the room as his words sank in. The next day, they decided to visit the old Albright estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of Windhaven that had been abandoned for decades. Maggie had the key, though. She admitted she hadn't stepped foot inside since Henry's disappearance. The house was shrouded in overgrown ivy, its windows dark and uninviting. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the scent of decay. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine as they entered the main hall. Its once grand staircase now warped with age. "It feels like time stopped here," she murmured. They split up, each exploring a different part of the house. Nate searched the library, while Lily climbed the stairs to the attic. Ellie and Maggie remained in the gallery, where Henry's unfinished work still stood, their colors faded but their emotions undimmed. As Ellie examined a painting of a shadowy figure, standing before a beam of light, Maggie gasped. "What is it?" Ellie asked, rushing to her side. Maggie pointed to a small inscription at the bottom of the canvas, barely visible beneath layers of paint for those who seek the truth. "The light will guide you." In the attic, Lily uncovered a trunk filled with old journals and sketches. Among them was a map of Windhaven, marked with an X over the forest near the lake. She ran downstairs, the map clutched in her hands. "I think I found something," she exclaimed. The others gathered around as she laid the map on the dusty dining table. "That's the lake," Nate said, tracing the path with his finger. "What's out there?" "Nothing," Maggie said. "At least, nothing I know of. But if Henry marked it, there must be something." Ellie looked at the map, her heart pounding. "Then that's where we'll go." As they prepared for the journey, an unspoken sense of determination bound them together. They didn't know what they would find in the forest, but one thing was certain: the answers they sought were closer than ever. The forest surrounding Windhaven had always been a place of mystery, a thick expanse of trees and hidden paths that few ventured into. The air was damp, and the ground beneath their feet was soft with the fallen leaves. Ellie, Nate, Lily, and Maggie walked in silence, each step heavier than the last. Their destination the spot marked on Henry's map, deep in the woods by the lake. The journey felt longer than it was. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees towering like ancient sentinels, their twisted roots creating natural barriers. The further they ventured, the more disconnected they felt from the town they knew. There was something unsettling about the silence, a quiet that felt too still, too unnatural. "Do you think Henry really came out here?" Lily asked, her voice breaking the tension. "I don't know," Maggie replied, her voice low. "But if he did, he must have had a reason." Ellie glanced at her, then looked around the forest. "A reason for what?" Maggie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowed her pace, her eyes scanning the trees. "This forest has always felt like a place of secrets. I wouldn't be surprised if Henry found something something that made him believe he had to leave." Nate, walking just ahead of Ellie, stopped suddenly. "There's something up ahead." They all followed his gaze to a clearing in the trees. At the center was a large rock formation, weathered by time but oddly symmetrical. The ground surrounding it was disturbed, as if someone had recently dug through the earth. "Here," Nate said, his voice tense. They approached cautiously, and as they drew closer, Ellie's heart skipped a beat. At the base of the rocks, half buried in the dirt, was a weathered wooden chest. It was small, about the size of a suitcase, but it was unmistakably out of place in the otherwise untouched forest. "This is it," Maggie whispered, her hand trembling as she knelt beside the chest. With a soft creak, the chest's lid popped open, revealing a collection of objects carefully arranged inside. There were papers, old photographs, and a leather-bound book. Ellie's hand shook as she pulled the book free. It was Henry's handwriting, the pages, filled with strange symbols and cryptic phrases. She opened the book to the first page, where a single sentence was written: "The truth lies in the shadows." Back at the edge of the clearing, Lily was examining the photographs. One in particular caught her attention. It was a picture of Henry standing with a group of people, strangers, all dressed in dark clothing. Behind them, The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, almost as if it was alive, watching. "Maggie, do you recognize any of these people?" Lily asked, her voice strained. Maggie took the photo, her face paling as she studied it. "I've never seen them before, but I think Henry might have. He was always involved in things I didn't fully understand." Nate walked over, reading the words Ellie had uncovered in the book. "This book looks like it's more than just a journal. It's almost like a guide." Ellie nodded. "It has to be. Look at these symbols. They're not just random." She flipped through the pages, tracing her finger along the cryptic marks. "That's what he was trying to tell us," Maggie said softly. "The truth. It's all connected." As they stood there, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a chill through the group. There was a sudden shift in the atmosphere, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ellie glanced around, her heart racing. "I don't like this," she murmured. "It feels wrong." "I agree," Nate said, his voice tight. "But we can't leave now. We're so close." Lily, still holding the photograph, looked up. "There has to be more. Maybe there's something hidden here, something we missed." They began to search the clearing more thoroughly, pulling aside branches and brushing away dirt. Ellie's eyes landed on a stone slab, partially covered by moss. It was set into the ground, almost like a door, and the markings on it matched the ones in the book. "Maggie, can you help me?" Ellie asked, motioning for her to come over. With a grunt, they both pushed at the stone, and with a low, rumbling sound, it slowly slid open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the earth. "Is this it?" Lily whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. Maggie stood back, her face a mask of uncertainty. "I never thought we'd find this. I didn't even know it existed." "We have to go down," Nate said, his voice steady. "This is the only way to get the answers we need." Without another word, they stepped into the darkness, the narrow staircase, leading them into the unknown. The air was thick with the scent of earth and old stone. As they descended into the underground chamber, at the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a large, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with books, artifacts, and old scrolls. "This is," Ellie started, her voice trailing off as she took in the sight. "A secret library," Maggie whispered, "a place that's been hidden for generations." Nate walked forward, his eyes scanning the shelves. "What is all this? Why was it hidden?" "This is what Henry was after," Maggie said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. "The truth. The Reclaimers, they've been collecting knowledge for centuries. Secrets about Windhaven, about things no one is supposed to know." Lily stepped forward, her gaze locked on a large, ornate book resting on a pedestal in the center of the room. "Look at this." Ellie walked over, her breath catching in her throat. The book was massive, its cover, adorned with intricate symbols that matched those in Henry's journal. Slowly, Ellie reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with more symbols, but beneath them, written in clear, bold letters, were words that made her heart stop. "To find the light, one must first embrace the shadow. The Reclaimers are the keepers of the truth. To reclaim what was lost, one must surrender all." "Reclaim what was lost?" Ellie repeated, her voice trembling. "That's it," Maggie whispered. "Henry wasn't running from something. He was trying to uncover something that had been hidden for centuries, something about Windhaven itself. And now, we found it." But as Ellie's fingers traced the words, a sudden realization hit her. The truth they had been searching for wasn't just about Henry, it was about Windhaven. And in uncovering it, they might just be about to unlock something far darker than they could have ever imagined. The weight of the book in Ellie's hands felt heavier than it should have. As she flipped through its pages, the words seemed to blur, merging into one overwhelming truth. Windhaven had been hiding something for centuries, something tied to the land, to the people, and to the very history of the town itself. The air in the underground chamber felt thicker now, pressing in on them as they stood around the pedestal. The flickering light from their lanterns cast long shadows against the stone walls, making the room feel alive, as if the shadows themselves were watching them. "This can't be happening," Lily murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "Henry knew," Maggie said, her voice distant. "This is what he was searching for. This is why he disappeared." He didn't just leave, chose to hide the truth, to keep it buried. Nate stood at the edge of the room, his back to them, staring into the darkness beyond the flickering lantern light. But why? What is so dangerous that they go to all this trouble, to keep it hidden? Maggie walked up beside him, her gaze locked on the walls, where symbols were etched deep into the stone. Because some truth can't be faced, not by everyone. Some things are better left in the shadows. Ellie shuddered. And what does that mean for us? There's a reason we found this place, Maggie said, her voice firm now. It's not by accident that we're here. The Reclaimers were the keepers of knowledge, but not just any knowledge. They protected things that could change everything, and they've been waiting for someone to come looking, to find the truth. And what happens if we find it? Nate asked, his voice low and tense. They'll know we found it, Maggie said. And if they know, there will be no turning back. Ellie took a deep breath and turned back to the book, the pages now seeming almost to pull her in. One page stood out half burned, the edges curled and blackened, but the words were still legible, scrawled hastily across the page. The cycle will repeat. The shadow claims the light, and the truth will be its price. To undo what has been done, one must embrace the final act, and when the light is returned, so will the shadows rise again. Nate leaned over her shoulder, reading the words. What is this? It sounds like a prophecy. It is, Maggie said softly, and it's the reason Henry disappeared. He was trying to stop it, to break the cycle. Lily looked between the two of them, fear clouding her eyes. What cycle? What price? What is this all leading to? Maggie paused, her hands trembling as she wiped away a tear. The cycle is the town's curse. It's tied to the land, to the Reclaimers. There's something that's been buried here for centuries, something powerful, dangerous, and every time someone uncovers it, the shadow rises again. People disappear, or worse, they're taken, like Henry. Ellie stepped back, her heart racing. This is what he meant by embrace the shadow. He wasn't just warning us, he was preparing himself. He knew what would happen when the truth came to light. Then we have to stop it, Nate said firmly, his voice resolute. If this cycle continues, people will keep disappearing, and this town, our town, will never be free. As they deliberated, the ground beneath them suddenly trembled. The lanterns flickered, casting shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. A low, guttural noise filled the air, coming from deep within the earth, like the sound of something ancient awakening. Did you feel that? Lily asked, her voice rising in panic. It's happening, Maggie whispered, her face pale. The shadow is rising. We've triggered it. The truth is no longer buried. Nate gripped the edge of the pedestal, his eyes wide. What do we do now? Maggie's voice was tight with fear. There's a way to stop it, but it's a choice we have to make. The book, she hesitated, then continued. It says that in order to break the cycle, one person must sacrifice something they hold dear. It doesn't say what it is, but the price will be high. Ellie's heart sank. And if we don't, the shadows will consume everything, Maggie said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. And it won't just be Windhaven, it will spread beyond this town. It will destroy everything. Lily swallowed hard, her gaze flickering toward the dark passage leading further into the underground chamber. We can't just give up. We have to fight back. But at what cost? Nate asked quietly, looking around at them all. We can't afford to make the wrong choice. The rumbling continued to grow louder, and the walls of the chamber seemed to pulse, as if the earth itself were alive, breathing in the darkness. The book on the pedestal began to glow faintly, its pages turning on their own, as if being guided by an unseen hand. The symbols in the book shimmered, and the air grew colder still. This is it, Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Whatever happens next, we have to be ready. The tremors intensified, and a sudden force slammed into the chamber, throwing them all to the ground. The book flew from its pedestal, landing with a thud on the cold stone floor. The symbols on the pages began to glow brighter, casting a light that was both beautiful and terrifying. A shadow, dark and dense, began to materialize in the corner of the room. It coiled and stretched, like smoke being drawn into form. Ellie could feel it pulling at her, the very air thick with its presence. No, No, Maggie gasped, struggling to get to her feet. We're too late. Nate, Lily, and Ellie scrambled to reach the book, but the shadow seemed to grow stronger with every step they took. It loomed larger, engulfing the room in its swirling tendrils. We have to stop it. Lily screamed. How? Maggie was the first to act. She threw herself toward the book, her hands shaking as she reached for it. As soon as her fingers touched the glowing pages, the room went silent. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The rumbling ceased, the shadows halted, and the air grew still. Maggie stood with the book in her hands, her face set in determination. This is the only way, she said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. I'll sacrifice myself. I'll be the one to stop it. No. Ellie cried out, rushing to her side. Maggie, you don't have to do this. We'll figure out another way. But Maggie shook her head, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut through Ellie's heart. This is the only way to break the cycle. I've known it all along. With a final, resolute glance at her friends, Maggie opened the book to the final page. She began to recite the words aloud. To break the cycle, one must embrace the shadow, one must give everything, and in return, the light shall rise again. The shadows swirled violently around her, and for a moment, Ellie thought they would consume her whole. But then, as Maggie finished the last line, the shadows screamed, a sound that echoed through the chamber like 1,000 voices in agony. The light exploded, blinding them all, and then silence. The next morning, when the sunlight broke through the trees, the forest felt different, calmer, lighter, as if the weight of years of secrets had been lifted. Maggie was gone, but Windhaven had been saved. The cycle was broken, and the shadows were no longer a threat. The town of Windhaven was still, eerily quiet, as if the very air itself was holding its breath. The sunlight that filtered through the trees outside the underground chamber was bright, but it felt muted, softer than usual. The birds were singing, but there was an unfamiliar calmness to their song, as if the world had been paused for a moment, waiting to see what would happen next. Ellie, Nate, and Lily stood in the clearing, their eyes fixed on the now quiet entrance to the underground chamber. The echoes of Maggie's final words still lingered in their hearts, heavy and bittersweet. Is she really gone? Ellie asked, her voice raw with emotion. Nate looked down at the ground, his hands clenched at his sides. I don't know, but I think Maggie knew what she was doing. She chose to make the sacrifice to break the cycle, to keep us safe. Lily's voice was distant, filled with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. She gave everything, and yet it doesn't feel real. We were just here, in this place, and now she's gone. Just like that. Ellie reached out and took Lily's hand, but she didn't just leave. She stopped something. She broke the cycle. We have to believe that her sacrifice meant something, that it wasn't in vain. Nate turned, his gaze fixed on the sky. The shadow is gone. The truth has been revealed. Windhaven is free. Ellie could feel the weight of his words, the truth in them. They had uncovered secrets that had been buried for centuries. They had learned about the Reclaimers, the hidden history of Windhaven, and the dark forces that had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. And in doing so, they had stopped an ancient cycle of pain and loss. But at what cost? The answer to that question hung heavily in the air, and it was something they couldn't quite bring themselves to fully grasp. Maggie's absence was a hole in their hearts, an ache that would never fully heal. But her bravery, her choice to face the shadows, would never be forgotten. The following days were filled with quiet reflection. The people of Windhaven seemed unaware of the cataclysmic event that had just taken place beneath their feet. Life, as it often does, moved on. But for Ellie, Nate, and Lily, nothing would ever be the same. They had been changed by what they had discovered, by the forces they had confronted, and by the loss they had endured. But they also knew, deep down, that Maggie's sacrifice had set them free. Windhaven could now begin to heal, to move forward from the darkness that had long plagued it. One afternoon, Ellie found herself standing at the edge of the forest, looking out over the lake. The wind was gentle, and the trees whispered around her, a soft murmur of peace. For the first time in a long while, the town felt safe. A figure appeared beside her, and she turned to see Nate, his face solemn but resolute. How are you holding up? He asked, his voice gentle. Ellie shrugged, her eyes distant. I don't know. Some days, it feels like Maggie is still here, like she's watching over us. Other days, it feels like a dream, like none of this is real. Nate stood beside her for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon. It's real, Ellie, and Maggie, she's with us. We carry her memory, her sacrifice, and everything we do. She gave us a chance to make a difference. Ellie nodded, but her heart still ached. It doesn't feel like enough, you know? I wish there was more we could have done. There's nothing more we could have done, Nate replied, his voice firm. We gave it everything we had, and we stopped it. Ellie turned her gaze back to the lake, the sun, shimmering on the surface like 1,000 tiny sparks. I know, but it still feels like there's more to the story, something we haven't uncovered yet. You think the truth isn't over? Nate asked. Ellie shook her head. I don't know. It's like there's a part of me that feels like we've only scratched the surface. The Reclaimers, the shadows, the truth about Windaven, it all feels unfinished. Like there's still something waiting for us. Maybe there is, Nate said, but for now, we have to live in the present. We can't change the past, but we can make sure the future is different. Maggie wouldn't want us to keep looking for something that isn't there. She'd want us to keep moving forward. Ellie looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. You're right, it's just hard to let go. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting, Nate said softly. It means honoring what we've learned and using it to make things better. For ourselves, for the town, for Maggie. They stood in silence, the weight of the world easing just a little. Ellie felt a sense of closure beginning to settle within her. Even if the ache in her heart would never completely disappear, she knew now that the journey wasn't over, it had only just begun. As the weeks passed, Windhaven began to heal. The people seemed lighter, more connected to each other. The darkness that had once hung over the town was gone, replaced by a new sense of hope. But it wasn't just the town that had changed. Ellie, Nate, and Lily were different too. They had uncovered the truth, faced the shadows, and emerged stronger. But they also knew that, like the forest that surrounded them, life was an ongoing cycle. The truth they had uncovered wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something new. And as Ellie walked through the streets of Windhaven, one crisp autumn morning, she realized that the town had transformed. The old, heavy secrets had been released into the light, and in their place, something beautiful was taking root. Maybe it wasn't the perfect ending, but it was the beginning of a new chapter that they would write together. The end.